Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So this is Dan Kahn. Okay, I gotta ask Jeffrey. That's a plugin you're using for Zoom. It's not the built. It's like a snap effects that you can add in.
Yeah, that's correct. It's an overlay.
Yeah, can you add the link in to the because my 11-year-old is doing Zoom distant learning from home now, and he's going to very much want that added.
Yeah, this looks like very very useful for that.
Actually, me and my 5-year-old experimenting that led me to find this thing.
Yeah, I thought I was doing well with my background right now, but okay. So first of all, I do just want to say that these are very challenging times right now, and so I very much appreciate getting 44 participants on the call is great, and I hope that all of you are safely able to work at home, and your loved ones and friends and such are doing well. So that I'm here in New York, and my family is fine, but certainly we are kind of battened down. So in terms of this Telecom user group, I'll point out that last week was supposed to be KubeCon Amsterdam, and that's when we wanted to be releasing the prologue white paper. That got delayed several weeks with the virus, and then with me focused on a board meeting last week. But I am actually trying to get that finalized in the next week or two, and then to move on to ideally a second or third white paper. And so the aspiration so far, at least on these white papers, is that they not be enormously controversial or shocking documents, and instead that they kind of catalog a moment, a point in time, that we can have a similar vocabulary and agreement on process and such. And then with an understanding that they will evolve over time. I think the prologue very much accomplishes that. And then I do have another white paper that I'm going to be sharing very shortly, which is largely about trying to get across some of the ideas in this CNF conformance slide deck that most of you have reviewed in the past. So I think that's the main updates I want to give on the white paper. We're going to have this call in 2 weeks on a more China-friendly time. I hope at least many of our Europeans here will be able to join that one as well. And I'll look to have meaningful progress. I'll also be announcing the plans or schedules and such in both the email and the Slack and the GitHub repo, so no one should be surprised by it. So then let me just see if there's any comments or questions or thoughts on the white paper before I go to the next topic. Okay, well, so in a minute, I'd like to have Taylor and his team walk us through the progress on this CNF conformance test suite. But before he does that, I think maybe it would make sense it looks like Robbie's not on, for Gergely to take us through some of the CNTT work that's occurred in the last month or so, and I think would be a useful context for talking about the CNF conformance test suite. Gergely, are you okay with that order, or would you prefer the other direction?
It's okay for me, like in this order. So what happened in the last weeks in CNTT is that we are still progressing with the development of the reference model and the reference architectures. We had a change in the schedules because of the coronavirus situation. So the current release called Baldy has been extended with 4 weeks. So we are still working on this release, and our target for this is to make the reference architecture to the Kubernetes-based reference architecture good enough that the reference implementation can be started. And to follow this, we kickstarted the work for the reference implementation work stream. We have the contributors and the workstation work stream set up. So we have a group of people who are willing to work on the reference implementation. And last week we managed to kick off the reference certification also. So in the next, or from the next release, we will work on both the implementation and the certification part. And of course, we truly believe that this should be a work together with the CNCF Telecom user group and CNTT. Also, we will have what we call a virtual face-to-face meeting. So it will be basically a virtual conference for several days, discussing the topics of CNTT. And I think Robbie posted the schedule to the minutes. And we will have a deep dive about the reference architecture 2 on 22nd of April from 11:15 UTC. We'll have a deep dive on the reference architecture 2. Then we will have a deep dive on the reference implementation 2, which is the Kubernetes based one, and then a deep dive about the reference certification 2. So this whole day, April the 22nd, will be dedicated to the Kubernetes based reference architecture in one of the tracks of the virtual conference. And also on the 23rd of April, we will discuss about how the reference conformance 2 can interwork with the other conformance frameworks and tests. So that will start from 11 o'clock UTC, April 23rd. And it would be really good if you could find the time to join. All of these sessions will be over Zoom and without any registration fee. And I think that is the update from CNTT. I don't know if you, Robbie, have anything more to add.
Thanks, Gary. So one more point, Dan, maybe it's worth mentioning OVP phase 2, LFN OVP phase 2. Now, as Gary mentioned, we're working very closely in CNTT to define the requirements. We're looking forward to discussing more with the TUG and CNCF test bed and CNCF conformance test around the RC2, especially when we start kicking it on. Now, to formalize this as an industry, LFN is bringing the OVP Cloud Native certification program that will allow CNFs as well as infrastructure to be certified against the CNTT requirements using test cases written by various communities, including the CNCF projects. Now, that will mean more collaboration, I think, will be useful between LFN OVP phase 2 team and the TUG in particular. Do you see any areas where potentially we could have some joint sessions or some discussions needed? How do you like to approach this in particular?
And Robbie, you're running the meeting as it's a single track in Zoom for 3 days.
It's three tracks, but all the cloud native sessions are in one track.
Okay.
Hey, Garge,
and
for the benefit of everybody, can you put the link in the chat for this virtual conference?
Yes, sure. I will put it.
Thank you.
here it is.
Ah, thanks. Dan was fast.
Although I guess I'm the cloud native track is on day 2 and 3 in green. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Well, I definitely will aim to be there. UTC right now is how much in front of Pacific time?
Probably 8 hours.
I'm not really good with time zones.
Yeah, it's very challenging.
7 hours.
3:15. So it's exactly. Thank you, Lucina. So
Yeah, it's like 4
okay. Well, I'll
a.m.
mention.
or something like that.
Yeah, this is much more convenient for me on the East Coast, but of course, with trying to get folks in China involved, there's never a great time to do it. Okay, Robbie or Gergely, is there anything else you'd like to add on the CNTT front?
No, at least not from my side.
I'm okay as well. Thanks.
Okay. Could I ask Taylor then to take a few minutes and talk about some of the development that he's been overseeing for the last month or so?
Sure. So on the CNF conformance, there's probably some updates on the CNF test bed, a little bit related, but focus on the CNF conformance first. So most of the work has been on the workload side. So CNFs actually testing CNFs are components of applications that would be running on top of a platform. And that's been continuing as far as adding tests that are focused on checking compliance with cloud native principles. So these are not focused on, say, integration tests or anything like that at this point. Those are probably out of scope. But the main focus has been adding more tests to validate the cloud native principles. And then in addition to that, it's been primarily focused on the development of those and making sure that environment for doing the test, building the test, and then doing validating that everything is working as expected from a testing standpoint's been working. So we now have the test running from a CI system and spec test for the entire conformance suite are now running on every commit. So that's been part of the effort. And then concurrently, what we've started looking at was how we can be aligned with some of the CNTT work. So looking at, we've been collaborating and working in the RI2 meetings as well as the new and upcoming RC2 for the conformance, and then doing a very deep analysis of the requirements on the CNTT reference architecture. So we're hoping to publish from the assessment, and there's some tickets and stuff. I'm posting a few things in the chat here. But what we're hoping to have as a result of this is some documentation that will go into the white paper. I'm sorry, into not the white paper, but a document that'll be on the GitHub page for the CNF conformance about testing for the platform itself. So we've been on the workload. Now we're looking at how to test cloud native aspects on the platform itself. And what we expect and what we're finding right now is there's some portion of the platform that's being built for CNTT as platform that should be covered by either Kubernetes conformance or maybe the extended EDE test. So some of the aspects in the requirements, the actual CNTT requirements, look like they're going to be covered. And then outside of that, what items could we cover with other upstream tooling? So that's kind of the path. And this would lead to complementary work with CNTT on the reference implementation. So if you look at, I don't think I gave this link. So if there's a lot of links inside of the CNTT RI2 workstream meeting notes where they go to CNTT specific tickets on stuff like what labs could we build for the RI2 on the CNTT side, what are different stages and layers for the CNTT reference implementation, the platform, or we should say the reference architecture, and then how can we choose those? So I think there's complementary efforts that go between the needs of the CNF conformance on the platform. We need to be able to have a platform that we can test the CNF conformance. Similarly to RI2 is a way to say, here are the CNTT, here's a CNTT platform. So looking at those and seeing where it overlaps has been a lot of the efforts. And because we've been using the CNF test bed, to bring that back, for the CNF conformance to deploy a platform onto Packet with bare metal machines and provision networking automatically and stuff. We've been looking at what aspects map between the CNTT reference architecture to requirements and what's covered by what we can deploy. And we're building basically a mapping to. Potentially the CNF testbed could be used for testing some of the CNTT on Packet, would be a nice outcome of this. I don't think it's going to be the only one. I think we're probably going to end up with several choices on the CNTT RI2 for being able to bring up some or all of the platform and run integration tests and stuff that's outside of the scope of the CNF conformance suite, but maybe in scope for, say, use cases and examples that we've been interested in on the CNF testbed, like a evolved packet core subset of the use cases that we've had different examples. Those are things that I think would be in scope. At the moment, we don't have any new documentation. It's kind of spread across a lot of the very rough documents and stuff marked down, but we're going to be working over the next, maybe by the next meeting, we'll actually be able to publish some of the findings that we've had.
Can you open the HackMD document from issue 103?
Let me bring that up.
Thank you.
I think this is one that we're wanting to bring over and put into a markdown on. Yeah, this is one where we'd like to copy this over and have it as, I can bring this up. Is this the one that I think you're referring to? This is out of this link here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Let me, no, I'm not sure. Yeah, this one, this is
Mm-hmm.
what you just posted. And then I got a 403 on that link.
Yeah, so this is what I was talking about, where
Mhm.
we need to, and what we'd like to do is take these HackMD docs and take those as source documents, and we're going to go ahead and create markdowns that
Mhm.
would be useful to publish in the CNF conformance. Probably some type of reference review type doc area would be a good way to do that, or we can decide on something else. But this one is the early part of this. What would some type of CNF platform conformance testing look like? So specifically the testing for, again, we're talking about cloud native aspects. We're not saying full testing for every aspect of what CNTT would cover, which is going to include integration testing for protocols and other things that are necessary for the, let's say, brownfield integrations and other things. What we're looking at is what are the aspects of the platform that should be, that we could cover from a cloud native aspect. And this particular document is the high level of that, and then thinking of stuff like this is a translation of requirements. So maybe the requirement for CRDs and using, let's say, APIs, open APIs and other stuff could map to stuff like CRDs and config maps. And then does it use device plugins and other things? This is a high level breakdown and trying to map as much as possible in this, and then looking at stuff like this is where we talk about coverage. So this particular area on network acceleration, this covers a few of this chapters in the CNTT reference architecture. So what are we looking at for Kubernetes coverage? Well, there's a lot of stuff that looks like it should be covered at least partially. So this is kind of an estimate, 40% here. CPU pooling, persistent volume, all these things. And then there's other things that are out of scope for Kubernetes specific testing, like multiple interfaces, but that could be part of, say, the CNI specifications, just like if you're looking at storage, CSI and stuff like that. But this is something where we'd want to take this, and we have many other documents. If you saw even like this reference, it's a massive amount of stuff that is primarily from looking at the language internally for the CNF conformance, and then kind of mapping that out. It doesn't, without understanding from the side of the code and other aspects of the CNF conformance, it wouldn't make as much sense. So we need to take these and make it into something that's usable outside, does a full mapping. So that's the effort now. This was the first effort to internally see, and there's a ticket, I think this was the 103. So this is the current, one of the main focuses is a more in-depth view of the Kubernetes testing amount. So this is breaking down each of those requirements. And this is using the language should, may, must, should, and may. So optional, is it optional? Is this recommended? Is this a hard requirement? The same thing that the CNTT is using. And then we are trying to interpret some of the requirements in a language that would make sense outside. So some of them, let's go right into, let me go to chapter 2 is probably one of the better ones. Some of them can go directly, like virtual compute. This seems to be a must. They're not all labeled, but we've tried to interpret as much based on the other knowledge that we have from going through these. And then looking at stuff like, is this in scope? So virtual networking resource. This in the CNTT context means, can you have virtual network interfaces with some other hardware specific things. This is outside of scope of Kubernetes. It doesn't mean it's outside of scope for cloud native conformance, but are we going to test it immediately with Kubernetes tests? Probably not. So we said it's not part of conformance, it's not part of EDE. And then it could be part of the Kubernetes extensions or add-ons. So this would be, say, CNI plugins could give you that capability. That's not something that we're doing in this round of, I guess, assessment, because we're trying to break this down and say we're focused on Kubernetes coverage first, and then we can come back through and look at extensions, add-ons, and then external projects that are trying to do coverage. And I don't know if folks are seeing the chat messages, but the goal here, again, is to take this and have something published into GitHub so that we can, or somewhere that's shareable so that we can start using it to talk about the complementary goals between the different projects. And this can not only go into stuff like what CNTT is doing with RI2 and RC2, but also OVP's work and other initiatives and projects.
Taylor, I think this is great. Amazing work done here. Thanks for that. One question I have: do you see any potential of giving some feedback to CNTT based on your analysis? Because I think one of the things that we really need to get a good grip on the feedback loop, where if you see during the assessment that any suggestions or recommendation to CNTT to change any aspect of what we do, please, would that be included in the assessment, or how do you see that?
Absolutely. We're on the RI2. We've been following the RI2 work stream, and we've attending those and trying to give feedback directly there. Talking a lot with Tom and Bill from Lutzy and other folks as they've been joining and trying to help with those. Some of those are specifically about trying to bring up the lab and other things. And then feeding back into the reference architecture itself, that is definitely something I think would be good, and we're trying to do that. I think as we're pulling this together over the next few weeks, then maybe some of that can directly go back in. So that's a goal, and I think something that we can keep doing. If there's some specific work streams that would be good to collaborate on, there's a lot. So if you can point out any specific ones that maybe we could start attending and directly collaborate on, besides RI2, which we're been engaged in, and I've posted on the Etherpad for the RC2 as well. But if there's anything else specific, then let me know.
Thanks, Taylor. This is great. Thank you.
You might join RA2, which is the full, would give you the full complement of the Kubernetes solution.
Sounds good. Thank you. I just shared a Google spreadsheet that I think probably would end up getting moved over to, I can reshare my screen. It's shared in the Zoom chat. But this is the start of a spreadsheet that we started on just last week, copying stuff from these massive amount of HackMD docs into a spreadsheet, which I think could be moved into the LF CNTT wiki in a spreadsheet format. It's hard to work in a spreadsheet, so this is why it's delayed. But the idea would be to have something that lists all of the requirements, which we've been trying to do. They're not in a format that's throughout the entire document that's directly explicit. This is a requirement. Some of them say this is a requirement and it must be. Some of them you have to infer it by context of paragraphs. But building out a table probably for breakdown, and you could see this is kind of an idea of it, of each chapter and probably sections, and then saying whether it's a must, should, or may type of requirement, and what sections are in, would be a good thing for everybody engaged. And so as part of the RI2 discussions, started building this. I think one thing that this would lead into, which is an open tickets on the CNTT side, is features. So if you look at requirements, you're going to take those requirements and eventually build out end user features. And to get those, you need to be able, if you have end user features, you need to say, what are the requirements? So that's the idea with this, the requirements behind it that we actually need to confirm. And then we can end up with items like this. So is this a physical or platform? I've added some other sections here that started to put in, tying in with what I was discussing earlier, like, is this covered by CNF conformance, or is it covered by EDE test? There's probably other aspects that we could put in here that would be useful for a broader audience. And with that, I think we could share a lot. I just deleted that by accident. But this is just kind of an idea to discuss, and maybe something like this would be good on the RA2, and I'll make sure and look at those meetings and try to get that on my agenda.
Yeah, I think a lot of this can also be reused in the RC too. So Taylor, thanks for all the work.
Welcome. Sounds good.
And last thing, Taylor, you mentioned also other industry groups. Do you mean OVP phase 2? Do you see also this is feeding into OVP phase 2?
I think so. I think that there's going to be overlap. It seems like there's, I imagine that the different initiatives are going to have slightly different end goals. Some of them will be shared, but there will be overlap. And my hope would be that we can find the complementary areas and then outline those. Of course, any missing gaps or anything that could help each other. But I think OVP would be one area where there's going to be overlap between, I'll say CNF conformance and say the CNF testbed, which has goals beyond the CNF conformance, like the use cases. But I think OVP 2 is going to have items that overlap, and then other items that are going to be beyond, say, the CNF conformance that need to be tested or would be desired. And I believe that there's probably other groups and initiatives and stuff, and you could think even direct projects. So if we have requirements listed clearly and people can understand those, then in projects that are trying to provide those would be able to improve themselves. So that could be specifically something like a project that's trying to provide multiple network services to a CNF in different ways, like a CNI, DANM, Multis. If we have feedback on desired requirements and features that are clear, then I think those projects would benefit because they can look at those and add potentially updates in their roadmap.
Thanks, Taylor. I posted the link to the chat, which is OVP phase 2 has been split into different work streams. One of those are to look at what are the projects available in the community that will fulfill some of those categories that defined in OVP phase 2. Now, there is a group, there's a category for CNF testing, and there's a category for infrastructure testing. And what we're trying to do there is to have a collection of what are the existing initiatives in the community that are trying to address those elements. So as a program of VP Phase 2, we're trying to collect those test cases developed for different industry, endorse the ones that are relevant, and building this program around the conformance for CNF as well as the infrastructure. So I think having a clear information in there around the great work you're doing, I think will be useful to understand and potentially have that part of the program that LFN is offering.
Definitely. On a related note, something that I hadn't pointed out yet was the some type of scoring system or results from running CNF conformance. So that's something that we've had in mind. And if you look at the slide deck that Dan shared earlier about the CNF conformance, we don't yet know what it's going to look like. What we think will probably happen is some type of spectrum, and then within that spectrum of scores, you could say there could be categories, and that's where gold, silver, bronze, and other things come from. And we've been looking into how scoring could work, and probably end up having groups based on the categories, which are the categories of CNF conformance are based on cloud native principles, essentially. And then within those, you're going to have pieces that could test different aspects of either the workload component, a CNF, or a platform. And within that, you're going to end up with a large set of small tests. If you're familiar with, say, any type of testing framework, it'll get down to pass-fail. So how that rolls up into weights on scoring, that's some of the efforts that's been happening over the last couple of weeks. And this is more of what's in a potential idea. Maybe you could think of this as like a prototype scoring. So there's some efforts on that right now, so that we can have some type of discussion over the scoring. And I think one of the big aspects we'll want to have feedback on the important items. Some of those we can infer from stuff like CNTT's reference architecture, where if it's a hard requirement, then it's probably important for operators. So that probably means that we need that to be a stronger, more weighted type of test potentially. And others, we may need feedback on weighting. And this could be anything from a group of tests would give you more positive points, let's say, to the maybe the extreme end. If you fail one of the tests that's very important, then you could potentially fail the whole test. And others may be marked as completely optional, just like the CNTT requirements that you have a may, which is an optional requirement. And if you fail those, then it may not have any effect, but it's a positive if you have it.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks.
So the scoring system will somehow factor in all the mays and shoulds as well then, in some way.
Yes, some type of weighting for that. It may not be a direct mapping to CNTT on those. There may be something that's, say, a should, so recommended requirement from the CNTT side, and then but looking at it from the CNF conformance, it's a must for the cloud native side, or maybe it's a completely optional. It doesn't matter from the cloud native side. So I think there's going to be overlap, but not a direct one-to-one mapping.
So Tara, one more thing we're doing in CNTT, we're introducing the concept of exceptions, meaning we might have a should requirement that will move to become a must in the next release. And this is where we're trying to manage the transition of the workload from being, let's say, non-cloud native into cloud native. So for example, we might allow a particular technology to be used in this release, but in next releases, the expectation is for vendors to move away from that given technology. So that requirement that used to be should, it will become must. Is that something similar reflected in the CNF conformance test? You see a way of implementing the same effect, or how do you see that?
I think it'll be similar. I would think that the CNF conformance is going to be organic and it'll grow based on the needs of the community. So if we look at stuff like maybe a cloud native aspect is not testable right now because it's not implemented anywhere, then we may take that into account when you're doing testing. But or we may say it's a hard requirement from the CNF conformance side, but later it's optional. It could go either direction. I think it'll be very similar.
Okay, thanks.
We have about, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, I think we might stop there. I'd open it up for anybody else who had some comments or questions on this. We'll hopefully be seeing a lot more activity from Taylor and his team over the next month or so that we can be following on that GitHub repo. I guess I might ask, because we have Frederick and Nikolai on the call, whether you have any comments on where NSM is right now, because I know that you were planning to release it at KubeCon.
Yeah, so in terms of development, so we're working to get a release out quickly. That way people can start to use it. So one of the challenges that we've had, and I understand why, is people have pointed out that NSM is not production ready, and so we're working to get an initial cutout that people can start to build and test against as quickly as possible, so that people can start to get a feel for how it can be included into these specifications. And I will also say that the NSM system itself should also hit full production quality long before the reference implementation is at a state where it's ready to be ran in similar environments. It's a much less complex project and platform. Also, one of the things that we've been doing is we also have been working with groups like the CNTT and OVP Phase 2. Not in order to help with cloud native, I guess outreach would be the right word, and not only NSM specific. Like, part of the way that I've been looking at it is what are the right things, or the right shape of things that we should have in place to help support CNFs, regardless as to whether NSM is in there or not. And the second task for me that I've been looking at is that is more NSM specific, is how to make sure that the wording of what's in CNTT is such that it doesn't prevent NSM from being included in the future, in the near future, once NSM is ready to go. And so those have been the main things that we've been working towards, is is helping with that. And one of the things that's helped with it is the CNTT has very smartly put into their system different layers. Like you have a reference architecture versus a reference implementation, where the architecture could say something like should support multiple connection endpoints, versus the implementation, which can then make a choice on one or more different things to check and provide forward for that initial implementation. So that's getting that wording to be more generic in the architecture has helped tremendously with those builds.
Can I add something to what Frederick was just talking about? It's not just generic terminology. It's specifically making sure there's a clear delineation between requirements, i.e. I need multiple interfaces into a pod. I need separation between control plane and data plane, versus architecture and implementation, which are typically recommending a solution. I know Tom Cliven has done a ton of great work in helping clean a lot of this up on the CNTT side. But as we're all kind of collaborating on this, I think it's super, super important that we don't stifle future innovation by making a solution a requirement versus describing what that solution should be providing via the requirements, if that makes sense.
I mean, for me, it makes sense.
Okay.
Question is for others. So.
Yeah, and we endeavor to make sure that that doesn't happen, right? And when it does, we try to fix it.
And certainly, and the best way to look at the CNTT specifications, whether it is reference implementation or reference architecture, it is evolving with time. And the plan is really to keep the innovation going. And if we see any other technology that it makes sense to take advantage of, we need to make sure it is reflected in the RA and RI. So one thing I would say is, even if we, in the reference implementation specifically, if we select a given technology to be the base of the implementation as CNTT platform, that does not mean that in the future releases we won't consider alternative technology. Certainly, this is an ongoing process, and we keep evolving technology. I think what matters the most to us, that any solution available out there, it is done in a consistent way to remove the fragmentation of our cloud platforms, and this is really the goal of CNTT. So as long as we keep that and we keep that completely abstracted from the workload, then underlying technology will evolve as the technology matures.
Yes, yeah, I totally agree. But like, we should not forget that CNTT works in a way that it needs to define solutions also, or it needs to define components and stuff like that. And this is why we organized the reference architecture work into different chapters. And we are organizing the work in a way that in chapter 2 we collect the requirements, chapter 3 the high level architecture design, and chapter 4 are about the components. But as Robbie said, we are willing to change these as time progressing and new technologies mature.
Yeah, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with being very prescriptive in the later chapters where you're specifically defining an architecture, specifically recommending an implementation. It needs to be clearly, pointed out in the different things. And like I said, Tom's been cleaning a lot of it up, so it looks a lot better now. But the earlier chapters need to describe what the requirements are to successfully deploy, cloud native networking. You don't want to start with the solution before you define what you're solving for.
Yes, I agree. And we still have some work to do in this, and I'm working with Tom on chapter 2 and 3 to clear them out.
All right. We got 7 minutes. Is there any other items to cover before we call it? Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, everyone. Thanks for the call today. I appreciate it. Getting a great turnout.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Cheers.
Bye bye.